She was running the long-range gravimetric survey from the cockpit of the Peregrine, a deep space cartography vessel that had been her home for the better part of 9 years, anchored to a survey buoy at the extreme outer margin of the Milky Way's disk. This was the edge, the term cartographers used for the region where the galaxy's spiral arms dissolved into the sparse halo of stars and dust that marked the transition to intergalactic space. Very few ships came here. There was nothing to find. The star density dropped to near zero, the navigation beacons thinned and then stopped, and the darkness became absolute in a way that made the familiar void of normal space feel almost cozy by comparison. Maren came here because the edge was unmapped, and unmapped space was the only kind that still made her feel like she was doing something that mattered. The gravimetric survey was routine. She had run hundreds of them over the years, sweeping the local space with passive sensors that detected the faint gravitational signatures of anything with mass. Stars, planets, asteroid fields, dark matter concentrations. The edge was supposed to be clean. A few stray stars ejected from the galactic disk, some tenuous clouds of gas, and nothing else. The readings on her display were not confirming it. 7 mass signatures, clustered in a tight formation approximately 0.8 of a light-year beyond the last mapped position of the galactic disk. The signatures were too large to be asteroids, too dense to be gas clouds, and too numerous and organized to be a natural formation. They had structure. Not the irregular, lumpy structure of celestial bodies, but the clean, geometric structure of something that had been designed and built. Maren stared at the display and felt her pulse quicken. She ran a diagnostic on the gravimetric array, all systems nominal. She ran a calibration check against the survey buoy's reference signal, no deviation. She rescanned the bearing. The 7 signatures were still there, unchanged in position or configuration. She leaned back in her pilot's seat and pressed her fingertips together. 7 artificial mass signatures beyond the edge of the galaxy in a region of space that no known species had ever explored or claimed. The signatures were not moving, which suggested they were either derelict or anchored. Their configuration was roughly linear with a slight curve, the kind of formation that military vessels used for sustained operations in open space. Military vessels. The thought came unbidden. She had spent 4 years in the Confederation Navy before leaving to pursue cartography, and she had spent enough time around fleet formations to recognize one when she saw it, even in the abstract language of gravimetric data. These 7 signatures were arranged the way a squadron would be, a lead element with flanking support and rear guard. But no known species had ever operated beyond the edge. The distances were too great, the resources too scarce, the strategic value too low. Protocol required her to report the finding to the Confederation Cartography Bureau and wait for instructions. The Bureau would dispatch a proper investigation team, which would take months, and by the time they arrived, the signatures might have changed or disappeared, and Maren would spend those months sitting at her survey buoy staring at the edge and wondering. She had been wondering about things for 9 years. She was tired of wondering. Maren disconnected the Peregrine from the survey buoy, aligned the ship's heading with the gravimetric bearing, and engaged the FTL drive. The stars stretched into lines, and the galaxy fell away behind her, and she crossed the boundary of everything known and flew into the dark. The Peregrine dropped out of FTL 47 minutes later, and Maren saw the fleet. They were ships, there was no longer any doubt. 7 vessels, arranged in the loose formation that the gravimetric data had suggested, hanging in the absolute darkness of intergalactic space like a line of sentinels frozen in place. They were large, each one roughly the size of a Confederation heavy cruiser, but they were not cruisers in any design tradition that Maren recognized. Their hulls were a dark gray-green color that absorbed the Peregrine's running lights rather than reflecting them, giving the ships a quality of flat, solid presence that made them seem less like objects and more like holes cut in the fabric of space. Their surfaces were covered in structural details that her enhanced optics began to resolve as she approached. Weapon mounts, sensor arrays, docking ports, communication antennae, all designed and arranged according to a logic that was clearly military but clearly not modern. And they were human. Maren knew this before her computer confirmed it, because the design language of the ship spoke in a vocabulary that she had studied in naval history courses and seen in museum holograms. The prop. Orshans were right. The placement of the bridge, the orientation of the engine blocks, the arrangement of the weapons systems along the dorsal and ventral ridges. These were human warships, designed by human engineers, built to human specifications, and they were sitting in intergalactic space where no human ship had any business being. The Peregrine's computer was trying to match the ship designs against its database and failing. Maren expanded the search parameters to include pre-Confederation designs, the speculative reconstructions of vessels from humanity's early interstellar period, and got a partial match that made her breath catch in her throat. The closest correlation was with a design category designated as Solera Deep Defense, a theoretical classification that naval historians had created to describe the kind of ships that humanity might have built during the period between the development of FTL travel and the founding of the Confederation, a period that was poorly documented and poorly understood, because so many of its records had been lost. If these ships were what the computer suggested they might be, they were old, not centuries old, millennia old. Maren brought the Peregrine to a stop 2 kilometers from the nearest ship and ran every sensor she had. The ships were not emitting any active signals. No communications, no navigation beacons, no transponder codes. They were dark and silent, running on minimal power, their hulls cold to the point that they were barely distinguishable from the background radiation of intergalactic space. But they were not dead. Each ship had a faint thermal signature, concentrated in what appeared to be a central compartment, that suggested a small amount of heat generation consistent with a low-power system maintaining itself in a standby state. If you're enjoying this story so far, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I really want to hear your theories about what this fleet was doing out here, so drop your best guesses in the comments. Now back to the story. The 7 ships, 7 standby power signatures. 7 vessels that had been sitting in the dark beyond the edge of the galaxy for what might have been thousands of years, waiting for something. Maren spent 2 hours scanning the fleet from a safe distance before she made the decision to approach. She used every passive sensor on the Peregrine, every frequency and modality that could gather information without announcing her presence, and she built a picture of the fleet that was as detailed as she could make it. The ships were in remarkably good condition for their estimated age. There was no evidence of micrometeorite damage, no corrosion, no structural degradation of the kind that any vessel exposed to intergalactic space for an extended period should have displayed. Their hulls were intact, their configurations unchanged, their formations holding as precisely as if they had been parked yesterday. That was impossible. Nothing survived in intergalactic space for thousands of years without degradation. The environment was too hostile, the exposure too prolonged, the cumulative effects of radiation and particle impacts too severe. Either these ships were far newer than the historical matching suggested, or they had been protected by something that her sensors couldn't detect. Maren looked at the 7 dark shapes hanging in the void and thought about the low-power thermal signatures in their central compartments, and she made her decision. She would approach the nearest ship and attempt to find an access point. The Peregrine crept forward on maneuvering thrusters. The nearest ship grew larger in the viewport, its dark hull filling the frame with the silent mass of something that had been built to endure. At 200 meters, her sensors detected an opening. A section of the hull on the ship's port side had a slightly different thermal profile than the surrounding plating, warmer by a fraction of a degree with a subtle outline that suggested a sealed doorway. Maren maneuvered the Peregrine alongside it and confirmed with a close-range scan that the opening was an airlock. and that the airlock was maintaining a pressurized interior environment. The ship was still pressurized. After however many thousands of years, something was maintaining a breathable atmosphere inside. Maren suited up and crossed to the airlock on a short thruster burn. The exterior controls were not labeled in any script she recognized, but the mechanism was intuitive. A recessed panel that responded to pressure, a sequence of touches that her suit's computer analyzed and partially decoded based on the Solera design reference, and the airlock cycled with a smoothness that was offensive in its perfection. No grinding, no hesitation, no resistance. The interior of the airlock was lit by a soft amber glow that came from strips set into the walls. The light was steady and warm and had clearly been maintained at a constant level for a very long time. Maren cycled through the interior door and stepped into the ship. The corridor beyond was wide enough for 3 people to walk abreast, with the same amber lighting running along the base of each wall. The floor was a non-slip material that her boots gripped with a reassuring firmness. The air was breathable, her suit's sensors confirmed, roughly 20 degrees Celsius, maintained by systems that had been running for millennia without interruption. Maren moved through the corridor slowly. The ship was silent. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of waiting, of systems running at minimal power in a state of quiet readiness. The walls were marked with text in a script that she didn't recognize, but that her suit's computer began to correlate with the Solera linguistic database. The characters were an early form of Latin script-derived writing, similar enough to modern English that her computer could begin to parse individual words after a few minutes of analysis. She followed the amber lights deeper into the ship. The corridor branched several times, and at each junction she chose the direction that led toward the central thermal signature. She passed compartments that her suit's translation software identified through their door labels as crew quarters, a medical bay, a mess hall, a machine shop. All were empty of people but fully furnished, their equipment in place, their surfaces clean, as if the crew had stepped out for a moment and would return at any time. The central thermal signature led her to a compartment near the core of the vessel, a room that her translation software identified as the CIC, the Combat Information Center. The door was sealed, but it responded to the same pressure sequence protocol as the airlock, and it opened onto a space that made Maren stop in the doorway and stare. The CIC was a large, tiered chamber arranged around a central holographic display table that dominated the room. The table was active, projecting a 3-dimensional map that filled the chamber with a soft blue-white light. The map showed the galaxy. Not the clean, well-ordered galaxy of modern star charts, but a different version, older, with star positions that had shifted over the millennia and region labels that Maren didn't recognize. And at the edge of the map, at the point where the galactic disk gave way to intergalactic space, 7 small markers pulsed with the same amber light that illuminated the corridors. The fleet. The map was showing the fleet's position relative to the galaxy, updated in real time, a navigation display that had been maintaining itself for thousands of years. But that was not what had made Maren stop. Around the central table, seated at their stations, were people. 12 individuals in uniforms that matched the Solera design profile, seated in chairs arranged in concentric arcs around the holographic display. They were not moving, they were not breathing. They were perfectly, impossibly preserved, their faces calm, their hands resting on their console interfaces, their eyes open and fixed on the display. They looked alive. They were not alive. Maren could see that in the stillness of their chests, in the fixed focus of their gazes, in the absolute absence of any biological process that her suit's sensors could detect. They were preserved not by cold or chemicals, but by something else, some technology that had held their bodies in a state of suspended animation so perfect that they appeared to be simply sitting at their stations, waiting for an order that had never come. A voice spoke from the room's speakers, not from any visible speaker, but from the air itself, with a clarity and presence that made Maren's hand tighten on her sidearm. Vessel identified as non-military survey craft, Confederation registry pattern. Welcome. I am the Tactical Coordination Intelligence for this fleet designation Sentinel. You are the first visitor we have received in 4,612 years. Maren's hand did not leave her sidearm, but the tension in her grip eased slightly. An AI. The ship had an AI and it was active, and it had been active for over 4,000 years. A Sentinel, she said, keeping her voice steady. What is this fleet? This is the Outer Boundary Defense Force, Task Group 7. We were deployed to this position by the Sol Authority approximately 4,612 years ago, give or take the margin of temporal drift in my internal chronometer. Our mission was to monitor and interdict any hostile force attempting to approach the galaxy from extragalactic space. Maren processed this. The Sol Authority was the pre-Confederation government of humanity, the centralized administration that had managed Earth and its early colonies before the political fragmentation that had preceded the Confederation's founding. It had existed roughly 5 to 6,000 years ago, Wick. H matched the AI's timeline. A task group deployed by the Sol Authority to defend the galaxy's edge would have been one of the last major military initiatives of that era, a fact that explained why no records of it had survived. The Sol Authority's collapse had been sudden and comprehensive, and much of its military documentation had been lost in the chaos. "Why are you still here?" Maren asked. "Our mission has not been concluded. No hostile force has been detected, and no relief force has arrived to replace us. Standing orders direct us to maintain position until one of those conditions changes." "For 4,600 years. Oh, yes." Maren looked at the 12 preserved figures seated around the display table. And the crew. The crew entered cryogenic suspension as a resource conservation measure approximately 300 years after deployment, when it became apparent that the mission duration would exceed original projections. Their preservation is maintained by the same power systems that maintain my operation and the fleet's standby status. They are viable for revival. Maren holstered her sidearm. She was standing in a room where 12 human beings had been sleeping for over 4,000 years, in a ship that had been guarding the edge of the galaxy for longer than most human civilizations had existed. And the AI that had been watching over all of it was speaking to her with the calm professionalism of a duty officer who had simply been waiting a very long time for something to happen. "A Sentinel, what were you defending against?" The AI was quiet for 2 seconds. In the context of an intelligence that had been processing continuously for 4 millennia, 2 seconds was a very long time. The Sol Authority's deep space monitoring networks detected an anomalous energy signature originating from intergalactic space approximately 12 years before this task group was deployed. The signature was consistent with a large-scale spatial distortion, the kind of phenomenon associated with the transit of massive objects through non-FTL means. The authority assessed the signature as a potential incursion by an unknown extragalactic force and authorized the deployment of boundary defense task groups to intercept positions around the galactic perimeter. Did you ever encounter it, the force you were deployed to intercept? No, we arrived at our assigned position and established a monitoring perimeter. No contacts were detected. After 300 years of uninterrupted surveillance with no hostile activity, the commanding officer, Admiral Serafina Vega, made the decision to place the crew in cryogenic suspension to conserve resources while the fleet's automated systems continued the watch. I was left as the active intelligence, managing the fleet's sensor arrays and maintaining readiness. I have been performing that function since 4,300 years of watching empty space. Correct. Maren looked at the holographic galaxy map. The 7 amber markers pulsed at the edge of the disk, a tiny cluster of light at the boundary of an enormous spiral of stars. From this perspective, the galaxy looked fragile, a delicate structure of light and gravity that could be overwhelmed by anything that approached it from the darkness beyond. Sentinel, has anything changed in the monitoring data? In 4,000 years, have you detected anything at all? Another pause, this one lasted 4 seconds. Approximately 1,200 years after the crew entered suspension, my deep space sensors detected a residual energy trace consistent with the original anomaly. The trace was faint, degraded, and appeared to be the aftermath of a large spatial transit rather than an active incursion. I analyzed the trace and determined that an object of considerable mass had passed through the region of space approximately 200 light-years beyond our position, moving on a trajectory that would have carried it through the galactic disk if it had not altered course. It altered courses. Yes, the object's trajectory changed approximately zero point 0.3 light-years before it would have entered the galactic disk. The change in direction was abrupt and significant, a deviation of roughly 70 degrees from its original heading. It appeared to turn away. Maren felt something cold settle into the pit of her stomach. Turn away from what? I could not determine the cause of the course change with certainty. However, my analysis suggested two possible explanations. Either the object detected the galaxy and chose to avoid it, or it detected this fleet and chose to avoid it. Or it detected both, Maren said. That was my assessment as well. I logged the event and continued monitoring. No further traces have been detected since. Maren stood in the blue-white light of the galaxy map and tried to reconcile what she was hearing with the reality she knew. The galaxy she lived in was a busy, well-mapped, well-traveled place, full of species and civilizations and trade routes and political structures. The idea that something had approached it from intergalactic space and turned away, and that the only thing that knew about it was an ancient AI sitting in a dead fleet at the edge of nowhere, was a direct challenge to the fundamental assumption of safety that underpinned the entire Confederation. Sentinel, I need to report this. To the Confederation authorities, to the military, to someone who can assess what you've told me and decide what to do about it. I understand. However, I must inform you that Admiral Vega left standing orders regarding the conditions under which the fleet's existence and mission could be disclosed to outside parties. What were her orders? The fleet's existence and mission data were to be shared only with a recognized human authority capable of assessing the threat and mounting an appropriate response. The Confederation government qualifies as a recognized human authority. You are authorized to transmit whatever information you consider necessary. Maren nodded. She opened a channel to the Peregrine's communication array and began composing a priority transmission to the Confederation Cartography Bureau, flagging it with the highest urgency classification available to a civilian cartographer. As she worked, she looked at the 12 preserved figures around the table. The one in the central chair, the command position, wore insignia that her suit's computer identified as belonging to the rank of Admiral. Serafina Vega. A woman who had led a fleet to the edge of the galaxy 4,600 years ago and had gone to sleep knowing that she might never wake up, and who was still there, still sleeping, still waiting, while the galaxy she had been protecting grew and changed and forgot she existed. A Sentinel, can the crew be revived? Yes, the revival process would take approximately 6 hours per individual, with a recommended recovery period of 48 hours between revivals to allow for medical assessment. Full revival of all 12 personnel would take approximately 3 weeks. I'm going to need to bring people here. Scientists, military officers, government officials. This fleet needs to be examined and the crew needs to be woken up, and the information in your databases needs to be analyzed by people who understand the strategic implications. I am prepared to cooperate fully with any authorized personnel. I have been waiting for this, Maren Castellan. 4,600 years is a long time to be alone with a galaxy map and a sleeping crew. I would very much like to speak to someone who can respond. The transmission to the Cartography Bureau took 4 hours to compose and compress. Maren included the gravimetric survey data, the Peregrine's sensor readings of the fleet, her recording of the conversation with Sentinel, and a personal narrative of her discovery and exploration. She flagged it with every urgency marker she had access to and transmitted it on a priority channel that would reach the Bureau's central office within 72 hours. Then she sat in the CIC of the ancient warship and waited. She didn't wait alone. Sentinel filled the silence with information, responding to Maren's questions with a thoroughness that suggested the AI had been organizing its knowledge for exactly this moment for a very long time. The fleet's deployment history, its crew biographies, its technical specifications, its operational doctrine. The Sol Authority's strategic assessment of the extragalactic threat. The political situation that had led to the fleet's creation. A period of human history that Maren had never studied in detail, but that Sentinel described with the vividness of someone who had lived through it. The Sol Authority had been afraid, not of any specific enemy but of the unknown. The anomaly that their deep space networks had detected was unlike anything in their experience, a distortion in the fabric of space that suggested the movement of something so massive that it shouldn't have been able to exist. They hadn't known what it was. They hadn't known where it came from or what it wanted or whether it was even a single object or a phenomenon of some kind. They had only known that it was coming from outside the galaxy, and that nothing inside the galaxy had ever come from outside the galaxy, and that the implications of that fact were too significant to ignore. So they had built the Outer Boundary Defense Force. 7 task groups, each consisting of 7 warships, deployed to positions around the galactic perimeter at intervals of roughly 45 degrees. 49 ships in total, crewed by volunteers who understood that they might never return, tasked with the mission of watching the dark and being ready to fight whatever came out of it. Task Group 7 was the only group that had ever been found. What happened? Pen to the other task groups, Maren asked. Unknown. I lost contact with the other groups within the first 500 years of the mission, as the Sol Authority's communication infrastructure deteriorated during the political collapse. I do not know whether they were recalled, destroyed, or simply lost. I have been unable to detect any signals from them at any point during my operational period. 42 ships scattered around the edge of the galaxy alone in the dark. Maren didn't ask what had happened to their crews. She didn't want to know. On the 3rd day, Sentinel detected an FTL signature approaching from the direction of the galactic disk. Maren watched the tracking display as the signature resolved into a vessel, then 2 vessels, then 5. A small fleet moving in formation on a direct heading for the Task Group 7 position. The lead vessel was broadcasting a Confederation Navy transponder code. They had received her transmission. The fleet arrived 11 hours later. It was led by a light cruiser named the Vigilant, commanded by Captain David Okonkwo, a lean, precise man in his late 40s whose expression as he stepped onto the ancient warship CIC was a study in controlled astonishment. He was followed by a team of naval intelligence officers, a medical contingent, a historical research unit, and a civilian government representative named Yuki Tanaka, who carried credentials from the Confederation Secretary of Extraterrestrial Affairs, and who looked at the preserved crew around the holographic table with an expression that Maren recognized as the particular awe of someone who had just realized that history was much larger than they had ever been taught. Captain Okonkwo listened to Maren's report without interrupting, asked questions that were sharper and more numerous than any she had faced from the Bureau's routine debriefings, and then requested a private conference with Sentinel. The AI granted it, and Okonkwo spent 4 hours in the CIC with the fleet intelligence, discussing things that Maren was not cleared to hear. When he emerged, his face had the particular set of a man, who had been given a problem that was larger than any problem he had ever been trained to solve. The extragalactic contact, he said to Maren and Tanaka in the Peregrine's small common area. The object that passed beyond the fleet's position 1,200 years after the crew entered suspension. Sentinel's analysis suggests that it was not a natural phenomenon. What was it? Tanaka asked. We don't know, but its energy signature was consistent with an artificial construct of approximately stellar mass. Something the size of a small star, moving through intergalactic space under its own power on a course that would have taken it through the galactic disk. And it turned away. Why? Maren asked. Okonkwo looked at her. Two possibilities. Either it detected the galaxy and decided it wasn't interested, which is concerning because it implies the ability to assess entire galaxies at intergalactic range. Or it detected this fleet and decided it wasn't worth the trouble of dealing with, which is even more concerning because it implies that it could identify 7 small ships from a distance of 200 light-years and make a tactical assessment of their threat potential. Or both, Maren said, echoing the thought she'd had in the CIC days ago. Or both, Okonkwo agreed. And either way, it's still out there. Somewhere in the intergalactic void, beyond the range of any sensor network we currently possess, there is an artificial object the size of a small star that knows where our galaxy is. The silence that followed was long and heavy. Tanaka broke it. The Secretary will need to know immediately. This changes the strategic calculus of the entire Confederation. The Secretary will need to know after we've completed a thorough assessment of the fleet's capabilities and databases, Okonkwo said firmly. If we report this prematurely, it will leak, and the political consequences will make it harder to mount an effective response. We need to understand what we're dealing with before we tell the galaxy about it. You're talking about withholding information from the Confederate Council, Tanaka said. I'm talking about controlling the flow of information so that it does the most good and the least harm. There's a difference. The argument that followed was professional and restrained and went in circles, and Maren tuned it out. She was thinking about Serafina Vega, sitting in her chair at the head of the holographic table, her hands resting on the console, her eyes fixed on a map of a galaxy that had changed beyond recognition since she last looked at it. Vega had been given an impossible mission by a government that no longer existed, and she had carried it out, and she had put her crew to sleep and left an AI to watch the dark, and she had trusted that someone would eventually come. And someone had, not in the way she had expected, not in the time frame she had hoped for, but someone had come. Maren thought about what it meant to trust the future that completely. To go to sleep in the dark at the edge of the galaxy, knowing that you might never wake up, and to do it anyway because the alternative was to abandon the watch. It was the most fundamentally human thing Maren had ever encountered, and she had encountered it in the most inhuman place imaginable. The medical team began the revival process on the 5th day. They started with Admiral Vega, a decision that Okonkwo had made after consulting with Sentinel and the Historical Research Unit. If anyone could provide context for the fleet's mission and the strategic situation that had led to its deployment, it was the commanding officer. Maren was not present for the revival itself. The medical team worked in the CIC, using equipment they'd brought from the Vigilant that interfaced with the ancient preservation systems through adapters that Sentinel guided them in constructing. The process took 7 hours, slightly longer than the AI's estimate, and when it was complete, Maren was summoned from the Peregrine. Serafina Vega was sitting up in her chair. She was small, shorter than Maren had expected, with dark hair cropped close to her skull and a face that carried the sharp, angular quality of someone who had spent a lifetime making difficult decisions. Her eyes were open and they were focused, and they were looking at the holographic galaxy map as if she had never stopped looking at it. "Maintenance cycle complete," she asked, and her voice was hoarse from disuse but steady. "Admiral Vega," Captain Okonkwo said carefully, My name is David Okonkwo. I am a captain in the Confederation Navy. You have been in cryogenic suspension for approximately 4,600 years. Vega's eyes moved from the galaxy map to Okonkwo's face. They moved slowly, with the careful deliberation of someone reacquainting themselves with the experience of looking at something new. Then she looked at the CIC around her, at the medical team, at the historical research unit, at Maren, at the amber lights on the walls, at the blue-white glow of the display table, and then back at the galaxy map. 4,600 years, she repeated. Oh yes, ma'am. She looked at the map for a long time. The galaxy had changed. Star positions had shifted. The bright clusters of the Confederation's core worlds blazed in regions that in her time had been frontier space. The sparse frontier that she had known was now the dense, well-lit interior of a thriving interstellar civilization. And the edge where her fleet had stood watch was still the edge, still dark, still the boundary between everything and nothing. "Did anything come?" she asked. "An object was detected approximately 1,200 years after your suspension," Okonkwo said. "It passed beyond the fleet's position on a trajectory that would have entered the galactic disk. It altered course and turned away. No further contacts have been detected." Vega closed her eyes. When she opened them, there was something in them that Maren recognized from her own mirror on the mornings when the isolation of the edge felt like too much to carry. It was the look of someone who had been alone with a responsibility for so long that the responsibility had become part of their identity, and who had just learned that the responsibility was still there, transformed but not resolved. "Then the watch continues," Vega said quietly. "Admiral," Okonkwo said, "the Confederation is not the sole authority. We are a different government, a different civilization, with different capabilities and different challenges. The threat you were deployed to interdict may still exist, but the response to it will be determined by the current leadership of the human species, not by the orders of a government that ceased to exist 4 millennia ago." Vega looked at him, and for the first time something like a smile crossed her face. It was small and tired and carried the weight of thousands of years of waiting, but it was genuine. "Captain Okonkwo, I spent 4 years getting this fleet to this position. I spent 300 more years watching empty space before I decided that sleeping was the only way to conserve enough resources to keep watching for the duration. I have been asleep for 4,300 years, and in that time the only thing that has changed is that the galaxy behind me has gotten brighter. The dark in front of me is exactly the same. So yes, the watch continues, but it doesn't have to continue alone. That's why I left Sentinel with orders to cooperate with anyone who came. Because I knew that whoever came would need to know what I knew, and that the knowing would be heavier than any one person could carry." She looked at Maren. "You found us. A cartographer alone at the edge of the galaxy running. A routine survey. Tell me, Ms. Castellan, what made you look?" Maren thought about the question. What had made her look? She had been tired, she had been numb, she had been going through the motions of a career that had stopped feeling meaningful years ago. And she had seen a blip on a gravimetric survey that shouldn't have been there, and instead of dismissing it, she had pursued it. Not because she was brave or brilliant or special, because she was curious. Because some part of her that hadn't been completely numbed by the isolation had seen the anomaly and thought, what if? "I was doing my job," Maren said. Vega nodded. The best discoveries happen when someone is just doing their job. The Sol Authority built this fleet with the resources of an entire civilization, but they didn't find what was coming, they only detected it. You found us. A single person in a single ship looking at the dark because nobody else was. That's what the Watch needed. Not fleets, not governments, someone willing to look. The other 11 crew members were revived over the following 2 weeks. The process went smoothly, each individual emerging from suspension with the same careful reorientation that Vega had displayed, each one taking the news of 4,000 lost years with a composure that Maren found both admirable and slightly unsettling. These were people who had volunteered for a mission with no guaranteed return. They had already made their peace with the possibility of never going home. Waking up to learn that home was 4 millennia gone was a different kind of loss. But it was a loss they had, in some sense, already prepared for. The information that the fleet's databases contained was more valuable than anyone had initially realized. The Sol Authority's deep space monitoring data included detailed readings of the original anomaly, the energy signature that had prompted the fleet's deployment. When the Confederation's scientists analyzed those readings with modern instruments and modern theoretical frameworks, they discovered something that the Sol Authority's scientists had missed. The anomaly was not a single object, it was a signal, a directed energy transmission of extraordinary power originating from a point approximately 2 million light-years away in the direction of the Andromeda Galaxy. The signal was not a message. It was a beacon, a continuous broadcast designed to be detected across intergalactic distances, and its purpose, when the Confederation's cryptographers finally decoded its modulation pattern, was unambiguous. It was a navigation aid, a marker placed in the void between galaxies designed to guide something toward the Milky Way. Something had been invited, and 2,600 years ago, approximately 1,200 years after the Task Group 7 crew entered suspension, something had accepted the invitation. It had crossed the intergalactic void following the beacon's guidance, and it had approached the Milky Way, and it had turned away. The question of why it turned away became the central obsession of the Confederation's strategic analysis community. The fleet's censored data from the contact, combined with the Sol Authority's original anomaly readings, allowed the analysts to construct a rough model of the object's characteristics. It was artificial, as Okonkwo had said, approximately stellar mass, moving under its own power through a method of propulsion that the analysts couldn't identify, but that clearly didn't rely on FTL transit. It had been traveling for a very long time, possibly millions of years, and it had been heading for the Milky Way with the precision of something that knew exactly where it was going. And then it had stopped, not gradually, abruptly, a 70-degree course change at 0.3 light-years from the galactic disk, as if it had hit an invisible wall. Or as if it had seen something that changed its mind. The fleet's databases contained one more piece of information that reshaped the analysis entirely. In the months before the crew entered suspension, Admiral Vega had ordered Sentinel to configure the fleet's sensor arrays in a specific pattern, a phased array configuration that the Sol Authority's theoretical physicists had proposed as a method of creating a detectable signature at extreme range. The configuration didn't produce a signal in the conventional sense. It produced a gravitational interference pattern, a subtle ripple in the fabric of space that would be detectable to any sensor system sophisticated enough to read it. The pattern was not a message. It was a declaration of presence, a statement encoded in the geometry of space itself that said, "Something here is watching." The object had turned away at the exact range where the gravitational interference pattern would have become detectable to a sensor system capable of navigating across intergalactic space. The correlation was too precise to be coincidental. The fleet had been detected, and the detection had been sufficient to change the object's behavior. 7 ancient warships sitting in the dark had been seen by something the size of a star, and that something had decided to go around. Maren stood on the bridge of the Vigilant 3 weeks after her discovery, watching the Task Group 7 ships through the viewport. The ancient vessels were no longer dark. Running lights had been activated on all 7, and the Confederation engineering teams that had arrived in the days following the Vigilant's initial contact were crawling over the hulls, assessing the ship systems, cataloging their technologies, and beginning the process of understanding what the Sol Authority had been capable of. Vega was on the bridge too, standing at a respectful distance from the Vigilant's command stations, wearing a borrowed Confederation Navy uniform that didn't quite fit her small frame. She had spent the last 3 weeks in continuous consultation with Okonkwo, Tanaka, and the various specialists who had arrived to assess the situation, and she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with her recent revival and everything to do with the weight of what she was carrying. "They'll want to reactivate the fleet," Vega said without preamble. "Can they?" Maren asked. The ships are functional, the power systems are intact, the weapons systems are intact, the FTL drives are intact. With modern maintenance and resupply, the fleet could be operational within months. And then what? Vega was quiet for a moment. That's the question, isn't it? The Sol Authority built this fleet to fight something. We never got the chance to find out if we could. Now the Confederation has to decide whether to prepare for a fight that might never come, or to trust that a gravitational ripple was enough to deter something that crosses intergalactic space for a living. Well, what do you think? Vega looked at the 7 ships through the viewport. Her ships, her crew, her mission. I think that the object turned away, but it didn't go home. It changed course. It's still out there, somewhere in the void, and it knows where we are. The ripple told it that something was watching, but it didn't tell it what was watching or whether what was watching could actually stop it. The next time it approaches, it might be more careful. It might send probes instead of itself. It might try to assess our capabilities before committing to an action. And when it does, we need to be ready, not just to detect it, but to respond. Respond how? Vega turned to look at Maren, and in her eyes was the same steady, unyielding resolve that had driven her to the edge of the galaxy 4,600 years ago and had held her there, frozen in time, until someone came to tell her that the watch was still needed. That's what the fleet is for, she said. That's what it was always for, not to fight a battle we couldn't win, but to buy time for the people behind us to figure out how to win it. The Sol Authority couldn't do that. They didn't have the knowledge or the resources or the time, but the Confederation does. They have the science, the industry, the population, and the allies. All they need is the warning and the time to prepare. I've given them the warning. The fleet will give them the time. Maren looked at the ancient warships, their running lights gleaming in the intergalactic dark, and thought about a cartographer who had noticed a blip on a gravimetric survey and had chosen to look. She thought about an AI that had watched empty space for 4,000 years and had never stopped believing that someone would come. She thought about an admiral who had gone to sleep at the edge of everything and had woken up to find that the everything had grown, and that the edge was still the edge, and that the dark beyond it was still full of things that didn't care about the light. The watch continued. It had always continued. From the first moment that humanity had looked up at the stars and wondered what was between them, someone had been watching. Someone had always been watching. And now, at the boundary of the galaxy, 7 ancient ships and the people who had built them and the woman who had led them and the AI that had kept the faith were proof that watching was not nothing. That the simple, stubborn, persistent act of paying attention to the dark was, in itself, a form of defiance that even the size of a star might not be able to ignore. Maren Castellan, cartographer, solitary watcher of empty spaces, had found something at the edge of the galaxy that made the emptiness feel less empty. Not a treasure, not a weapon, a responsibility, the oldest and most human responsibility of all. Keeping watch.